For joining our webinar, Network Leadership Lessons from the Field. We're going to pause for just a minute here while everybody kind of jumps into the room. So bear with us for just a moment. We hope everybody's enjoying this beautiful day. Hopefully it's as pretty as it is where you are. Some of us are here in Denver today. All right. Well, excellent. We have a pretty big crowd today to see our star, Miss Blythe Butler, talk today on network governance as an empowerment tool. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thanks again for joining. I'm Danielle Varda from Visible Network Labs in the University of Colorado, Denver. It is my pleasure to host today's webinar. Our regular webinar series, Network Leadership Lessons from the Field, is our monthly webinar where we try to bring interesting topics out to the field presented by the people who are doing the work. And by that we mean this is not going to be a big academic exercise. We try to find really interesting projects, really interesting work that people are doing, and bring that into our monthly webinar. But this isn't your average webinar. We have noticed over our years of doing this that the people who we meet and learn about in all of the work that we get to do are pretty much as interesting as the projects that they're doing. So what we are really going to focus on doing today is a couple of things. One is letting Blythe do her presentation, of course, but before that, we're going to spend a little time getting to know Blythe a little bit more and really getting to share with you all kind of the wonderful person that she is, and that's been a really fun part for us of starting our webinars this year. And some of our presenters like videos on and some off, and Blythe is one that likes them on, so it's fun today to get to kind of get to be in front of everyone too. So just before we do that, I'm going to kind of go over our background a little bit of the webinar and who we are. So this webinar is co-hosted by Visible Network Labs and the Center on Network Science. So I'm presenting here. You'll see Robin Mauve. She's our co-director at the Center on Network Science at the University of Colorado, Denver. And she and I are working on the work that goes into running that center. I'm the CEO and founder of Visible Network Labs, which is where most of our technology sits, and I'll show that in a second. To the right, you're seeing most of our team and people who you probably interact with if you use any of our tools or come to any of our trainings. So just a little bit on kind of what we all do. At Visible Network Labs, we provide tools and training, things like that, for folks to work in collaborative innovation, usually in their communities. So we provide data analysis and visualization tools. We have an awesome data dashboard, network mapping tools, data collection tools for if you're interested in getting kind of the network data that helps to inform this practice and provide evidence-based and ways of thinking about networks. And then we do trainings like this and our webinars, and also have a forum, which we call the Connected Community. All of that is on the website at visiblenetworklabs.com. But most of our now systems evaluation and research is the home. We keep that in our home at the Center on Network Science at the university. So we are in a great partnership across those two things that we do together, and just a really dynamic team if you put all the parts together. I do like to just talk a little bit about network science, what we mean, what it is. It's really the science of how things are connected. You'll see me give a talk if you show up at any of our events on thinking like a network scientist. You probably already are. You just might not already use that term. We use ideas like the strength of weak ties and try to provide different ways of understanding that for practice. There's a ton of tools on how the platform works and how you can use data. We're really focused on using data to do this kind of thinking in a way that builds capacity in communities. And then our dashboards and analytic tools help you kind of turn all of that science and data into practice and really translate it into tools and strategies and action steps. So our goal is to help you get kind of from the understanding of networks all the way to having data on how to do that work as well. So we thought we would share a little bit of information about our training program. So you can find out all the information you need at networkleader.org. The Network Leadership Training Academy is coming up very soon here. It's a 3-day event in Denver where 100 people come together from all over the country and other countries as well to really geek out together for 3 days on running networks and being in communities and learning from each other, and also hearing some pretty interesting big talks kind of on where the field is now. We also have a more kind of focused 2-day fall workshop where if you really want to come and bring your work with you, we do that right here in Denver. And then we do these kinds of webinars and demos online all the time, so check out the site for that. We'll take a break in April from our webinars because of the NLTA, but then we'll pick them back up again in May with more and interesting people. So lots of ways to stay connected with us. And then just before we get started with Blythe, we do try to kind of let you all know why we do this work. So we've learned from years of working in communities with networks and people who work in those networks that there is kind of a way of working that's called the network way of working. It's really not a new norm. It's very actually, you know, kind of set in practice right now, whether you're in the public, private, or nonprofit sector. But what we've really learned by that is that it's really different when you are really all bought in for that and you are all in versus knowing how to do that work. So going from even getting people to agree to work together across boundaries to understanding the skills that you need to do that work. How do we integrate that into our job descriptions and, you know, take what we know that feels kind of like serendipitous feelings of connections and ways of connecting together and turning it into a real practice that has strategies. So that's what we are trying to tackle through all of these different ways that we work together, is really trying to figure out how do we take what we know intuitively as humans and turn that into like sense making so that we actually have tools and resources for that. We call this work network leadership. Our kind of framing that we do all of our work around is build, managing, and evaluating effective networks. And I'll just go through this really quick. It'll be kind of the last thing here. We do focus network leadership around 7 core values. The first one is about network leadership being inclusive. And what we mean by that is that this is not a leadership that means it's for an individual or the backbone organization or the leader of the network. Network leadership really is skill building for everyone. So whether you're the dad running, you know, in a PTA trying to bring people together, or you're running a big national network, or you're just a citizen wanting to be involved, we think that everyone deserves and should be open to network leadership skills. We also really believe that network leadership should be community and culturally sensitive. So we'll never deliver anything that's the 5 ways of doing something or the 10 best practices in. We just believe that every community, every network has a different history, has a different culture in which it's set, and that what we're hoping to do is provide skills and trainings and capacity building that lets you understand how to adapt all of that in your particular context. Of course, this is all relationship focused. We're very skills based. I've mentioned that several times. So we're trying to get beyond kind of agreeing that we know networks are good and really trying to think about the how do we do these things now? I mentioned that it's a data-driven kind of work that we do. So we believe data can come in terms of stories, pictures, surveys, all kinds of things, but that, you know, when we use a data-driven approach, we can actually make better decisions for our networks. And then following on that, we value being reflective and then adaptive. So all of the work that we do, both as an organization, either at the Center on Network Science, at Visible Network Labs, or with our community partners, are about these 7 values and guided by them. All right, so now the really fun part. So it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Blythe Butler from the First 2000 Days Network to our webinar. Hey, Blythe, so good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And rather than kind of going through a typical bio on Blythe, she is going to present on her work and thinking on governance as an empowerment tool. But we are going to spend a couple of minutes just getting to know Blythe a little bit, because I definitely feel like it's not fair for all of our attendees not to get a glimpse into these completely interesting people who come and present on our webinars. So, so I'm going to ask Blythe a few questions, and some might be a surprise for her, and some we've prepped ahead of time, so you can you can answer these. Okay, so to get started, so I'm guessing that a lot of people on the call either work already in the field of networks and network science or to some degree, but there's also a lot of people that are wondering, how do I do this kind of work? You know, how do I actually make a living off of helping people, you know, run networks or support networks or evaluate networks? And so I was wondering if you could tell us all a little bit about your career path that landed you to this place where you're like a network guru now.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Danielle. That's very kind. And thanks for the opportunity for being on the webinar today. In terms of careers, I think like most people's, you know, you end up taking paths you didn't expect. But I think to any extent that the people who are on the call today, to the extent that you work with other human beings, you're doing a bit of network science because it's about relationships. So I've had the privilege of carving out a career path that is based on helping people figure out how to work together. So there's a little bit of change management in there. There's a lot of quality management in there. There's some you know, process design background in there, but I think anyone can start from anywhere and land here, really. I joked with Danielle a while ago that I spent my adolescence training as an elite synchronized swimmer, and I don't think there's any stronger network than a synchronized swimming team. And so I think that was my basic training for network science, was dealing with the culture of how to be a good synchro team member.
That's awesome, because one of my next questions was, when did you know you were a network scientist? I'm still going to ask it, but I'm wondering if it had to do with synchronized swimming.
No, I think actually after we were lucky enough to work with your team and the Center for Network Science at the university on our first formal use of the partner tool as an evaluation methodology. I think then it sort of became real. So I would actually say it's as a result of working and just being lucky enough to work with you guys on making it tangible for others who aren't in the weeds but are curious about the work. So yeah, I'd say that made it real.
Cool. Well, and I was trying to remember when I met Blythe, and Blythe is one of those people that I can't remember when we met, really, but I can't remember really not knowing you. One of those things. So we think that we met at one of our network leadership trainings. Well, we know we met at an NLTA, but we just don't know when in how life goes on. But Blythe, you've held a number of different, or worked with a number of different networks since we've known you, and really become. You're the first person I knew had a title, I think, of Network Weaver for your job. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe just telling us a little bit about First 2000 Days, how we know you, or any of the other networks that you've worked on?
Sure, and I'm actually going to go into 3 different ones in the presentation. So the one that sort of led me, that gave me the title Network Weaver was the First 2000 Days Network, and so that's a very community-driven, sort of ground up inter-organizational network of different organizations and agencies who serve children and families in Calgary. So yeah, we'll get into it a little bit more, but that's basically where I started to really think through what is a network, because the group I was working with had the word in their title, in their name, and I thought I better figure out what that means. So yeah. Nice.
Good. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So one more question. So what's been the hardest part of the work that you do and related to networks? And do you have any tips for people who might also be struggling with the same thing?
I think the hardest part around this work is increasing people's tolerance for ambiguity and helping them manage that. And that is a very one-to-one kind of diagnosis in terms of why people are maybe struggling with the ambiguity, and how you go about sort of meeting them where they're at. So whether that's a funder, frankly, whether that's another leader at the table, it doesn't matter who that is. There's different kinds of ambiguity in a network approach than there is in an organizational approach, a traditional organizational approach. And I think that's what people struggle with the most. Tips is to just learn about why they're feeling anxious and why they need the certainty and what the certainty is supposed to be for. And then you can figure out what to do about it.
Oh, awesome. I know your experience is far deeper than I actually know you are able to even talk about on this webinar or even in these questions. So what I'm thanks for answering those. You know, we're about to launch a podcast so that we can do deeper discussions with people, and you bet Blythe will be on those. It's really interesting when you get to talk to these folks who think really deeply about networks, kind of how their brains work and tinker in this field has just been one of probably my favorite parts of being a part of the community. All right, so I'm going to switch into the topic, today. And I do want to add, if anyone has any issues with, you know, technology or something like that, go ahead and stick it into the chat box. But then if you have any questions that you want to queue up for Blythe at the end of her presentation, go to your little box at the bottom where it says Q&A and stick them in there. And that will help us kind of differentiate between, you know, tech questions and other questions for Blythe. Blythe, if it's okay, I'm going to give a quick background kind of on how you and I have got to this place of talking about governance really quick. This idea, well, first of all, Blythe is going to touch on this. You know, what we call this topic today could vary. It's almost anything we talk about with networks. Like, you know, we're still all trying to figure out the language. But what I feel really strongly right now about, after doing a lot of evaluations with folks like Blythe, but you know, across dozens of communities that we work with, we really have noticed that there's been an uptick of people wanting to understand how to govern, how to be stewards of networks, and how to do the work. It's the part, sometimes I think of our process instead of build, manage, and evaluate networks, I think of us as grow, do, and learn. It's the do section, right, of all of this. Like, how do I actually do this work? And if I'm leading this group, what on earth do I do? Do I go with consensus, you know, decision making and, you know, a majority? What are we doing and how are we leading it? Do we have a board or not? And some of you will know that I wrote an article a few years ago asking this is a little, you're going to know where I think sometimes, but our backbone's eroding the norms that make networks succeed. And I've been curious as we've been evaluating with networks, we've seen more and more that are struggling with basically transitioning from maybe having adopted a backbone model to trying to figure out how do we exit that when our funding is gone, or when our values have changed and we no longer want to lead a big community network. And we've been approached with that question. And as people at CNS and VNL, I don't know the answer. I don't know how to help people understand in communities just what to do. But I think there's a lot of people out in the community that do know. People and people like Blythe have had those experiences. So Blythe and I talk a lot about this topic, and I can't think of someone who might, you know, be thinking about it more than Blythe. And I really think of her as a thought leader right now in the field, kind of helping us understand this problem and really thinking through what to do next, because we're kind of at a crux point right now where we just really want to figure this out so we can do better network work and greater impact in our communities. So I kind of wanted to give this little context, but it's one of our favorite topics, and I'm going to pass it over to Blythe now to take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Danielle. And if I don't address the question of the backbone piece, can you remind me to do that before the end? Because I have an idea on that one. So okay. I'm assuming everyone can see my slides okay?
Hey, Blythe, I'm going to turn off my video now.
Okay,
you can leave yours on? Okay.
Yeah, I'll leave mine on. Yeah, I'll leave mine on. And everyone can see the slides. We're good to go.
Yes.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. let's jump in here, and I'm going to assume at the beginning that lots of you know about networks and why they matter, and that you will all have a little bit of curiosity that you've already like dug into around networks. So I'm not going to go into network stuff too deeply, but I will reference them throughout. So let's go. The first slide is really to say, and Danielle's covered this, that I am a practitioner. I don't have an academic background in this per se, but it's been sort of the core of the work that I've done throughout my career. And now there's something called network science that I can plug myself into, which is great. So just wanted to say about where I'm coming from. I'm also coming from Calgary. So I know there's lots of people from all over the globe on the webinar today, but I wanted to give those, lots of you are from Denver. We're only a 2-hour and 20-minute flight away. And we're like basically northwest from you. And so this is where we live, just on the edge of the Rocky Mountains, and Denver and Calgary feel very similar in lots and lots of ways, even in terms of geography. So shout out to all the Canadians on the call. And what we do in Canada, we've recently gone through a truth and reconciliation process, similar to the one held in South Africa, regarding our Indigenous peoples. And part of the practice we take at the beginning of every meeting and every conversation that we can is to acknowledge the land that we're on. And so Calgary sits on Treaty 7 territory, which is part of a broad, long, several tens of thousands of years of history. And so we acknowledge that that's the land we are on, and the picture you see there is actually the monument to the signing of Treaty 7. And so a shout out to all of our Indigenous friends whose land we are on. All right, it's important to define terms. As I said, when I started with the first 2000 Days network, I actually didn't assume that I understood what a network was, and so I went digging and landed squarely in Danielle's lap to try and figure out what this network thing was. Because if I was going to be helping people develop a network, I wanted to know what it meant and what it looked like. And so the term network can be defined simply as a system of interconnected things, and to remind ourselves that a social network is as it relates to society. And if a system is also a set of things, and this is Donella Meadows' work on systems change, they produce their own patterns of behavior over time. And my little addition there is that networks are essentially systems of people, and that people are autonomous agents. And that really presents a challenge from a governance perspective, because you're trying to manage people who actually can think for themselves and do what they want. And you might not have any formal authority over what and how they do things. And that is the challenge. This term collaboration is obviously a part of how networks operate. And I love this sort of idea of having a collaborative relationship, because, and the idea that people are autonomous and have autonomous agency means we are always negotiating what our roles are, because we're trying to figure out what we can do over time in the context of the collaborative. And so to ignore that negotiation is always going on can really hinder the process. And so my colleague Gail did a great paper on this idea, and I love it, so I wanted to share it with you. So really quickly, for those of you who can, I wanted to just get you to type into the chat box, and Melinda and Danielle will help me keep an eye on stuff, but wanted to ask you, what is governance? If you had to define it, how would you define it? And I am actually gonna pause for 20 seconds while people type in. So ready and go. No one's typing in. Oh, there we go. There we go. Yeah. Keep them coming. Structures, guardrails. Yeah, so these are all great. Keep them coming, actually, because we'll compile these at the after the webinar and do a bit of analysis on them. So lots of stuff coming through around processes and procedures and all of that. So I'll go in a little bit onto what governance is. So it's all of the things you're mentioning. And it's interesting to note that there's not just one definition, one common definition coming through, right? So it's all of those things. And ultimately, it's about how we organize ourselves to make decisions. And we are not the only society that does this, right? Animals do this. To some extent, natural systems do this. They all have governing functions or governing mechanisms. So if we think about governance, we have to think about, you know, what are some core ideas in terms of human organization. Some of you have mentioned decision making, voice, who is actually included, and how is accountability structured. So those are three ideas behind governance generally, and understanding where the voice comes from, how we legitimize the voices that are a part of it. When we talk about accountability, my question would be to whom? If there's no organizational hierarchy or ultimate person in charge, how do we decide who to be accountable to and when and why? That idea of transparency, which is huge, that depends on information flow, responsiveness, how we're being effective. Can we actually use the resources we have in a transparent way to actually maximize their use? And of course, these ideas of fairness. So the structures and processes have to be perceived as fair in and of themselves. And if you want to learn more about that, you should come to the NLCA and listen to Darren Hicks and get an update on his research, because it's all about how fair governance piece cannot be missed. So second question, what is governance for? What should it do? I'll give you another 20 seconds to just type in. What is the function of governance? Builds alignment and understanding, ensures equity, ensures quality, holds space for decision-making, partnership building, coordination. Yeah, so those are all great. Keep them coming. So this is what I was asking that question to get through the difference between function and form. I think when we jump to governance, we think of what's the structure, what's the policy, how does all this fit together? Can we draw it out on a piece of paper? Where do I go find, like, how's it organized? And that's great. That's us focusing on the form of governance, or all the pieces and how they look. What we're more interested in today is certainly the function, and that function around, you know, if it's to organize and make decisions, organize for what purpose, decide about what. And in the description of the webinar today, we had this idea of how do you govern in order to empower? How do you govern in order to engage and in order to build those shared voices? So the fundamental question becomes, well, what makes people feel empowered? And how do you know? So taking the time to actually find that out. Some people feel empowered by really strong top-down guidance. You're going to do this and you're going to do that, and that gives them the clarity and they're confident in the process. They just want to be told what to do. That's a form of empowerment. It's antithetical in some ways, but it actually, if it empowers them to contribute, then that's what you're after. And some other people really brush up against being told what to do. They actually feel like they have enough going along and they have enough to contribute and they don't need you to tell them. So figuring out what makes people feel empowered through your governance approach is actually really critical. So the key concept that I'm going to drive sort of through the examples is people feel empowered for different reasons over time, and it can change throughout the course of the collaborative. So the governance process really needs to fit that reality and adapt to that reality, because people, if you're building capacity in the collaborative or in the network, the governance will actually need to change. So if we could empower people to collaborate, contribute, engage, continuously improve, and actually think and care about the network, my argument would be that it would be a more successful collaborative and network. You'd have a higher chance of being successful. And related to empowerment and why people feel empowered is the idea of trust. So it just goes back to, again, finding out what makes people trust in a collaborative. For some, again, it's the structure, it's the formal organization and the hierarchy, and for others it's not. And certainly in networks, that hierarchy and that formal organization can be really messy. So one of the terms I've started using is what's the proxy for trust? If the trust isn't amongst the individuals in the group, so if the relationships aren't there yet, what do the people in the group actually need to trust in order to build relationships? What's the starting point? And I'll talk about 3 different sort of examples of that. This book, which I will recommend highly, we'll hold it up because I'm still pouring through it again. The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. He has just gone through high-performing teams in various different fields of human endeavor and figured out what makes them tick. And I highly recommend it because it actually talks to this precisely. That group performance depends on one behavior that communicates one powerful overarching idea, and that is we, the collective, are safe and we are connected. If your governance structures can be driven towards that feeling, you will have empowerment at all kinds of different levels. Now, there's an art and a bit of magic in that. It's actually just a lot of fun work. So that feeling of being safe and being connected is a culture, right? So you can't ignore culture. You can't design governance in a vacuum. You're designing it within an existing culture. And governance should actually enable your founding principles to be enacted. So the first thing often groups do is come up with a mission and a vision and a bunch of value statements. That's great. The next step is to figure out what kind of governance structure would actually amplify those cultural attributes. If a high quality network is about trust and collaboration and participation and authenticity and being adaptive, the governance should actually match that and not get in the way of that. And that is really critical because we all have values up on the wall and then they fall apart when we go and try and actually live them in a lot of ways, especially when the group is under stress. That's when the values just don't stand up. So if you think about governance as different types and levels of governance, and especially over the maturity curve of a collaborative, it might not just be a one-time-fits-all kind of approach, although that's very tempting. And so this quote around, if the only tool you'll have is a hammer, everything will be a nail. Not all networks and not all collaboratives are created equally. So not the governance can't be created equally either. So the first example I'm going to give you is this. I'm sort of trying to articulate archetypes. It's the archetype of a tapestry. So this network is the first 2000 days network that I was talking about before. And there's some key characteristics there. It's community-based, so lots of community-based participation, local coalitions, parents, grandparents, agencies who are in neighborhoods. The participation from day one, which we decided very explicitly, was that it was open. Almost because the former collaborative way for the early childhood sector to collaborate or come together prior to the first 2000 days network was the funder invited you to a committee table. That drives very different behavior than we don't care who you are or where you work. If you love kids and parents, come help us figure this out. So we deliberately chose an open participation at our backbone, actually, like right at the core. Anyone could come to any meeting. It didn't matter. Come once, come every week, doesn't matter. There was a long history, as I'm sure it is with all of you. Every sector has a long history, but there were several attempts to get collaborative work underway. Several rounds of funding, several rounds of getting things going. So we had to honor that and figure out where the opportunity was. And then lots of competing interests, which is standard for most of us. We're all going after the same dollars. And that's a problem. We had loose backbone support because we didn't want to overdo the structure too early on, partly because we wanted to figure out what the context was. But importantly here, our collaborative outcomes were not funder driven. We had this amazing investment from our funding community that actually let us take 3 years to define the kind of innovation, the kind of collaborative, the kind of collective impact we wanted to have and how we were going to drive that. So we actually had incubation funding and some space and some time to do that really, really well. And I can honestly say without that incubation period where we just were learning like stink about all the pieces of the puzzle and what networks are and what collective impact is or isn't and how all that fits, we would have lost a really critical foundation. So with all those characteristics in mind, in terms of our starting point, these are some early slides that actually helped us figure out what our governance should look like. So initially we referred to as the network as the bridge, right? So there's all these systemic level groups and there's agency level groups and there's those who have direct contact with children, then there's the children themselves, and we sort of saw ourselves as that bridge in the middle. How do we get those pieces of the system talking to each other? Then we could figure out how we should organize ourselves and how we would make decisions. This is just another way of illustrating that. Like, here's the bubble of all the pieces of the system, and we're actually going to try and make sense of it. That took us almost 3 years to articulate explicitly that that was our function in the system. So again, what it was governance for, what should it do? That depends on what you're trying to do with your initiative. You can't design governance in that back without knowing that. So the function of the first 2000 Days Network is essentially to manage the white space in the early childhood system. It's not, we don't deliver programs and services and we don't fund anybody. So we're something else. And in order to do that, this became our governance structure. So we have a group of people who are doing the backbone functions, not as staff. They all have other jobs. They come together once a week. We figure out what needs to be done. They take responsibility for taking it back out into their node and community and bringing it back in. And this just continues. There's no formal reporting. There's no formal hierarchy. I take on some of the, administrative load around reporting to funders or writing reports or that kind of stuff, right? There's people who actually do have responsibility for those pieces, but that's not the kind of load we want to put on our community. So we own that and we try and take responsibility for that and keep it in the middle. So this is as close to a governance structure in terms of process and procedure and structure that the first 2000 Days Network has. And frankly, it's all we need. Because the feeling, back to the Culture Code book, the feeling there is that the open, loose, and shared governance was the proxy for trust in this particular group. They needed to be able to be authorized to do what they wanted. Because we trusted them, and we said, you're the experts in child development or parent support. You tell us what needs to be done. Like, let's go find out from you. So it was very much community driven and sort of middle built versus us sort of having all the research and just saying, well, this is what we're going to do here. So the sentence I've used to describe the feeling is, I believe you know what you're doing. This is a place for you to do it, to share it, and for all of us to build on it. That's the kind of governance there. The second example is a little bit different. I'm calling it the container, because what this group needed was they were a steering committee or an executive management committee. They had been together for a couple of years. They had done lots of great work in little pockets. And so they really we needed to reconfirm what was the container they were working in. So they wanted to leverage opportunities specifically around coordinating services and scaling things that worked. So they had they knew that they wanted to do those things. There was already action groups working, but the decision-making needs and the authorities were kind of mixed. Like, there were some people that thought they were on one committee and they were co-chairs of the other committees, and they were all in this steering committee, and they had all the right pieces of the puzzle, just that they needed to reaffirm their clarity. And so, and the other key piece here is that at the point that I was engaged, they had one sort of major funder who had very specific outcomes, and so they needed to reorganize around those. And so all we did was actually talk through, okay, well, what would be almost like a decision-making path or a governance path? And there's tons of work behind this slide. This is like, this is a 50,000 foot view. But reconfirming what they were there for, who was engaged at what level, what kind of criteria they were going to use to know what actions to take, and then having a decision-making process, that was all they needed to actually like sort of go to the next level. And this is maybe no different than what you would do inside an organization, so it's not necessarily network specific, but for their makeup and for the people who had been at the table, this was a really valuable way to just keep pushing the conversation around governance. And so their solution was really based around accountability and common goal. So we just had to get clarity around what was our common goal. Let's remind ourselves again, and how are we accountable for that? And then who's in the best position to actually drive us toward that? So here, the feeling is we all know what we're trying to achieve. Now we can actually govern that piece of the puzzle. And then the third example I have, I'm calling the Trampoline. And this is a network in Alberta that's recently developed in the last year. I've been involved for a year. It's called the Alberta Nonprofit Network, and it is a fascinating case study for me personally, because it's almost the antithesis, like on a spectrum, it's the almost opposite starting point as the first 2000 Days Network. So the reason why I'm saying it's a trampoline is because it's kind of this launching pad, like they're jumping off into this new space together. And the key characteristics of this network is that it's an inter-organizational network. There's 10 executive directors collaborating together on creating an Alberta nonprofit network. So we haven't had one before in Alberta. Lots of states and other provinces have them, but in Alberta, it's quite fragmented. There's sort of regional representative for nonprofit organizations and voluntary organizations. And they've been talking actually about creating an Alberta-wide network for a few decades at least. So the collaborative capacity is kind of varied. All of them have unbelievably strong organizations and are all amazingly successful at serving the sector in their own right. So that can be a challenge when you're trying to then collaborate. It should be a leverage point, but sometimes it gets in the success or the strength of the organizations can actually get in the way. It's all top leadership representation, which is an amazing lever for change. It's actually really, really lucky. It's something the first 2000 Days Network does not have in terms of formal authority at the table, or not to a great extent. But where they were at is they didn't have any structure or process holding them together. So they had the vision, unlike the previous example. They all have their own community-based reach, but together they didn't have anything holding them together. And so this is what we're calling the network anatomy of that network, which is that there's this, what we're calling an exploration committee in the middle, which really has the job to explore how this network's going to be structured. And then they've over time realized there's some key issues they want to galvanize around, and we're just at the very, very start of developing these steering committees to actually then go out into community and engage and find out more information and actually frame out what they're going to do around that issue. And so there's this whole scoping process, and there's a consensus decision-making process behind this that actually drives out how this structure is actually going to play out. And a key part of this particular network is making sure the engagement with community is robust, because we can very easily get in the habit of navel gazing at the 10 organizations who are doing all the work, but they're not the network. The network is actually the whole nonprofit sector. And as there's 29,000 nonprofits registered in Alberta, so we have a lot of work to do. But kudos to the 10 executive directors who have given their time every second Friday to have a conference call to actually get this kind of work done, over and above running their organization at full speed. So I can't say enough about the commitment from the people who took this on and who jumped in to get it done. This is an idea of a governance structure that's more formal than the first 2000 Days Network. So there are tons of processes and documents that we've developed, terms of reference, you know, all these kinds of things. And that's because the proxy for trust with this group was that they needed structures that they recognized. They needed terms of reference. They needed a consistent decision-making process that was written out. We needed a scoping form to actually do project planning. We needed sort of more conventional organizational paperwork so that they could engage, because if it was too open and too loose, like the first 2000 Days Network, they would have just been, it wouldn't have helped them move forward. So we sort of used what they were used to in their organization and pulled it into the network. But that means we have to actually drive the collaborative culture conversation really hard and remind ourselves not to default to those pieces of paper to tell us how to behave, because that will end up ruining it in the long run. But as a starting point, that was really helpful. So for them, I think the feeling now is, you know, we have a clear process. Now we can work together to prove that concept that we have, that network anatomy. Can we actually breathe air into that and get things done together? And so it's a very exciting time for this network, because they've sort of built the foundation and now they're ready to run, which is great. So I've mentioned Darren as one of the colleagues that we work with at the University of Colorado, Denver, and the Center for Network Science, and Danielle. And he had a great quote one year in his presentation at the Network Leadership Training Academy, which was, you know, with clarity comes confidence, with confidence comes commitment. And I think what I've tried to do in those last three examples is actually illustrate what kind of clarity different collaboratives need. And they're not all created equal. So figuring out where the clarity is lacking, or even what kind of clarity people are seeking, especially in networks, because they are ambiguous and they are messy and they are all on the side of our desks usually. You know, people lose sight of how to contribute. It's not that the opportunity is not there. So I love Darren's quote. I think it's the crux of good governance, actually. And I'll just add to it that it's the feeling of safety and trust that allows people to engage. And you can build all the terms of reference you want, but they will never be sufficient to have someone truly trust the process. So with engagement, you then have the opportunity to empower people, which was the whole reason for the webinar, is to think about empowering people, empower them through safety, through a feeling of safety and connectedness. And they will offer things that you couldn't possibly imagine if you can find a way to allow the governance of your collaborative to do that for them. And one other way of thinking about that, and this will be my final slide and then we'll have time for Q&A, is really to think about how does the governance structure actually enable increased levels of distributed intelligence? So not one person or one organization holds the information. How do you distribute people's caring or leverage what they care about? Just because what they care about isn't on your strategic plan, don't stop them. Let them go down that road and bring back what they are passionate about. You know, how do you increase the levels of responsibility that people are taking, what kind of capacity they're building, how they adapt to the different, you know, changing circumstances? This is all sort of what percolates underneath the surface for me anyway, is keeping an eye on these things. And the definition of wisdom there is one from a colleague, my mentor at Human Venture Institute. So when a system or a person or a network is wise, it sees what needs to be done, does it successfully without being told what to do. And so there's a large degree of self-authorization in there. And part of that, frankly, so I'll talk about the funder thing, part of our responsibility, I think, as network and collaborative practitioners is to educate our funding community about what that actually means. What it means to allow a community to decide what needs to be done. and how the funding community can support that process, not necessarily just the outcomes, but the actual process of doing that. So that's, those are my thoughts on governance. And I have to say, I have to thank all the people who are involved in the collaboratives that I highlighted here, because it's not me doing any of this, it's actually them. So thanks to all of them.
Awesome. So I'm turning my video back on so that I can go through the Q&A with Blythe. So if any of you have questions, make sure and put them in there. And Blythe, thank you so much. You know, we talk about this so many times, and like when you started doing Archetypes, I'm like pulling out my computer and taking notes frantically again. And I was like, how come she's never talked about this with me before? Maybe we have, I don't know, but I just, I'm so impressed with how much your thinking evolves as you go through this work. Like, you are not a static thinker at all. I mean, every time we talk, you've got something new you're thinking about. You hold up the book that you're reading now, and just all the things you hold in that space is just amazing to me.
Thanks. Thank you.
I have a question, but we have 3 already in there, and so I don't want to hold those back from people. So if we have time, I'll ask my own at the end. So you can see them as well. I'll go ahead and read them out loud. Okay. So the first one, can you talk about what kinds of time members of your network are putting into the work? I know we struggle a lot with the balance of people feeling like the network is worth their time and energy, but also being strapped for time to commit. Thanks, Hannah, for that question.
Yeah, it's a good question. It varies. I think so one of the structures as if a structure is one of the proxies for how you govern, the first thing I did when I joined and came into the first 2000 days place, because it existed for a year and a bit before I clued in. I instituted weekly meetings. And my thinking on that was from my work in organizational development and change management, that you cannot build a culture unless you are face-to-face with each other across the room or talking. Like, it just doesn't happen. And that was a huge ask. I knew that. But, you know, organizations have staff meetings, lots of them, weekly conversations with staff. Why would this be any different? Now, the caveat to that was that it was an open invitation. So I didn't know who was going to show up, and I didn't know if they were going to show up consistently. And I just made it clear that I didn't care. I wanted people to come who had something to share that would make the system better. And over time, we now have regulars, right? But we also just have new people. Like, literally last week, there was people we'd never met coming to a meeting. That's 5 years later, right? Yeah. So that was one example. The last example, the Alberta Nonprofit Network, we have a bi-weekly call every Friday morning for an hour, and everything else is done by email. But that call is in everyone's calendars now, and that's how we communicate. That's how we touch base. And the middle example, they meet. I think they meet monthly. And they have an amazing collaborative coordinator who does all the work in the background, trying to loop them all in so that they don't have to all be in the room. So it just depends. But I have a I personally have a high expectation for connecting.
Well, and if it's okay, can I add something? Because I think about this a lot from our network science lens. One of the core principal components of thinking in network science is that more is not better. And I think that, you know, when we do work with networks and we're looking at their data, I always say, you know, a key strategy should be to try to get to a point where you're asking, so it's a little different from Blythe's answer, to get people thinking, what is the least amount of asks that I can make of this group? Where every time I ask them, they know exactly what their role is, and they know how it's going to be valuable for them to participate. And that takes a lot of time to get from, you kind of have to start with like everyone in the room all at once. And then over time, and I believe with data, you can start to understand who would play those roles. And if you can get to a point where people are only participating when they know what their role is and what their value is going to be, that's what sustains networks. It's the thinking that everyone has to be participating all of the time where networks start to fall apart. Yeah.
I would agree with that. And that's why I'll just go back to that slide. That's why this structure actually really works.
Yeah.
Because it's totally up to what gets brought to the room, and that's left up to them. And that changes the speed, quote unquote, at which we can do things. But we're not worried about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to combine the next two questions, and they're both about. So one is, how did you use the Visible Network Labs platform, the partner platform, to support your networks and build trust and confidence? And then that's from Rachel and from Rick. He's asking, in your examples, did you use the partner tool, and how did you develop descriptions of a network anatomies evident in the slide? Oh, that's kind of two questions.
So we did partner with Danielle and her team to do two network analysis through the partner tool with the first 2000 Days network. So we worked with the team. I should mention we have an amazing colleague, Sammy Berger, who's based in New York, who does really great developmental evaluation. And so Sammy was really instrumental in helping us work with Danielle's team to help us ask the right questions through the partner platform, and that has been instrumental. So the data that we have from Partner Tool categorically changed the way we could manage and design and govern the network, like flat out. So yes, we've used it twice with First 2000 Days Network, and we will be using it with the Alberta Nonprofit Network when the maturity's a little further along. So it's on the radar for sure. And we use lots of the questions that are embedded in the partner tool actually quite regularly. We don't use the tool regularly, but we use some of the ideas embedded in the tool really regularly with Alberta Nonprofit Network to track our sort of process outcomes. So yeah, the short answer is we use it all the time. The network anatomies in the slides what I do is I draw them on a piece of paper and then I hand them to a graphic designer. So, not without asking the group if it actually reflects reality. So it's a process, but we didn't. Those are actually, sorry. What I'm trying to say is the images you see are done by a graphic designer, but we also have images of our network and of our network map directly from the partner tool that we also use.
Okay. And one thing I'm going to add about Blythe is when we work with folks like Blythe, we learn so much, so like the combination of trying to figure out how to measure things and how to display those kinds of information in ways that are useful to people. Like a map is a map, but you can't really make sense of it unless you've asked really questions in a way that are going to be meaningful at the end. And working with Sammy and Blythe has taught this is why I'm amazed by them, like the amount of learning that we've had by work when you see it happening in real time, and the way that Blythe and Sammy translate that is just, it's kind of magical. So we're calling on them all the time to help share that with people. So Blythe is the person for that. And Sammy's actually they're both coming to our NLTA this year to talk about that very topic. It's translating that data into stories and maps and coaching. Actions and coaching. So one last question here we have. So from Dylan, who, for those of you on the call, Dylan is another amazing network leader working in our federal government. So Dylan asked about educating people, in this case funders, about network processes. And he asks, do you have any specific recommendations for how to do that? And when dealing with skeptics, like people entrenched in legacy hierarchical systems, what techniques do you utilize and what leads to your success? A good question.
That's a really good question. I mean, I think part of it's just recognizing that systems and hierarchies and organizational structures exist for a reason, and it's because they actually serve a function. And for instance, a large bureaucratic system might have its downfalls, but there's a lot there to be used as positive drivers for achieving a goal. So, you know, I think we'd be remiss to say that classical or conventional organizational structures don't have a, you know, don't necessarily have a place or have value. But I do understand the nuance of your question, and that's around, you know, we're all stuck in those traditional mindsets, and I would say that's your starting point, is to sort of ask, well, what are those traditional ways of working helping us achieve our goal or not? And I would also say, you know, a network or a collaborative approach, to some degree, like, only use it if you have to, because it's a lot more work, it's a lot more load, it's a lot more tension, it's a lot more people management, like all of these things, it's a lot more of all of that. So if you know your environment doesn't have room for all of that, and you don't have the resources to drive all of that, you know, just be very careful. But Dylan, I'm happy to talk to you more about that. I think there's a lot of leadership questions embedded in that. So one of the articles that we use a lot is the Monitor Institute's Catalyzing Networks for Social Change, which I can't even remember when it came out, but it's a pretty good reference document for thinking through things like leadership or funding, or, you know, how you grow a network. It's a good sort of, hey, read this and let me know what you think kind of a document.
Nice. And I'll add one more thing to that as well, because we're working with a group that we started working with this week, and you know, they want to convince hospital administrators that network you know, approach and network data collection is going to be beneficial to them. And they literally asked us, how are we going to convince them of that? You know, how are we going to convince them to change their structure or their approach, or even be open to doing a survey around that data? And my experience with the skeptics, Dylan, or people who aren't used to that structure, is that they have to see themselves in the structure. So like, let's say it's a network map, you have to color them a certain way and label them a certain way and talk to them about the network from their perspective, a very egocentric perspective. It might sound counterintuitive to what we're trying to do, but when people can see themselves in the network, they start to understand the network effect better, and they want more, you know. And so I think it's a little bit of, it might be educating, but it's also kind of, you know, it's like presenting something in a certain way so that when you can see yourself embedded in it, your mindset on opening up to, you know, a systems thinking, it does begin with us. Even in the same way we measure a lot, like what's the value of the network to the outcome or the community. And a lot of times we have to also articulate what's the value of that one member for being a part of the network. Even though we're talking about a network effect, people need to go back to their home organizations and describe the ROI, right, for their time spent of being a part of that group. So helping people articulate individual value might sound like not the kind of thing we're trying to measure in networks, but it really can shift the buy-in and the way that people think about how they're going to engage, or even shift entire thinking. So
and data. So you have Partner Tool and you know, Visible Network Labs, who are leading, you know, pioneering the field of being able to actually measure what other people perceive as intangibles. And so numbers resonate, and it's all what Danielle said. You just have to meet people where they're at. I think that's the beginning for all of it. Yeah.
I love that you just said that. Our team, I'm always saying, we love to measure the hard to measure things. Like, give us something hard to measure. And I can't tell that story without saying the day that we said that, and this guy looked at us and said, "You mean like love?" And we were like, yeah, like love, but we're not trying to measure love. We're just trying to measure, you know, relationships. Maybe that is a part of love. Actually, we know our friend Curtis Ogden talks all about love in networks. Well, I want to say thank you. I'm also going to call one thing out real quick. Rachel, who has joined this call, Rachel Dickinson, wrote into the chat, and she was like, so Rachel, I'm calling you out right now. You're like, hey, these are all interesting people. Who are we all? And I've seen a lot of you introducing yourself, and I just, like, that just really made me so happy, because that is exactly the experience that our team gets to have all the time, which is all these people trickle into us and our organization, and they're so interesting, and everybody's geeking out on networks, but we're all doing all this really different work out in the world. And Rachel, I just wanted to say thank you for kicking that off, because I learned a lot about the people who showed up on this call because you did that. And this is going to be my one little plug for something that we do. We are experimenting with putting a forum up on our website, because we are curious if we do that and there's a place for people to meet each other and geek out together and do these things, will they use it? So if you're at all interested in staying connected to these kinds of people and wondering where these kinds of people are in the world, we're hoping that's a landing spot. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. We're not going to feel too disappointed. But if folks are open to that, if you go onto the website and go under community, there's a forum there, and it's just getting started. We've got a couple of posts in there, but we're really trying to see if that kind of thing is the kind of thing that people could use as support for peer learning and connection. So it just triggered my brain, Rachel, when you did that. So thank you. Okay, so Blythe, I kind of took over the last few minutes there to say that I got overwhelmed with what was happening during the webinar. You all can imagine how lucky I feel to know Blythe and to be able to work with her on all these different things. Both she and I are really open to meeting people and talking about these things. I mean, geeking out is kind of like putting it mildly. So stay connected. We'll send out all of the slides and the video after. And, thank you, Blythe, again, for your time. You do so many things. I don't know how you manage it all. And it's just really an honor that you spent this time with us and all of us on the call. So
it's my pleasure and my pleasure, and looking forward to hopefully meeting everyone on the call in person at the NLTA.
Yay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. All right. Have a great rest of your week, and stay connected. Look out for our next announcement for our webinar. Bye.